The silence in that small American town was no ordinary silence. It was dense, heavy, as if each narrow street carried stories that no one else dared to tell. The streetlights flickered with an ancient weariness, and the cold wind dragged dry leaves across the cracked asphalt, producing a sound reminiscent of hesitant footsteps. It was late afternoon, the kind of twilight where the sky seems to hold its breath before finally darkening. In this setting walked a man who carried the war etched not only on his body, but in his eyes. Henry Jones was a war veteran, not an ordinary ex-soldier, but someone who carried entire conflicts within him, battles that hadn't ended when his uniform was put away. Henry walked slowly, his pace controlled by a habit that had never left him. Even years after returning home, he still walked as if on patrol, attentive to every sound, every shadow cast by the old facades. His heavy coat hid scars that no one in that city fully knew. Some were visible, marks left by shards of glass and falls. Others, deeper, were buried in memory, untouchable, throbbing in silence. He stopped for a moment in the middle of the sidewalk, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes. The smell of the cold air mixed with damp earth brought back memories he hadn't invited, memories that insisted on permeating the present. The city seemed to watch him. The dark windows, the empty balconies, the motionless parked cars. Henry Jones always felt that this place knew him better than the people. There, he didn't need to explain why he woke up in the middle of the night, why he avoided crowds, or why he kept his distance. There, he was just another war veteran trying to survive ordinary days. But that afternoon, something was different. There was an invisible tension in the air, an unsettling feeling he had learned to recognize on the battlefield. It was the same feeling that preceded something unexpected. That's when he heard the sound. A low, restrained cry almost swallowed by the wind. Henry froze. Instinct spoke before reason. The war veteran slowly turned his head, trying to locate the source of that fragile sound that stood out from the silence. The crying came from a small park, one of those spaces forgotten by time, with a rusty swing and a slide marked by years of neglect. The dim light from a lamppost partially illuminated the place, creating long shadows that moved with the wind. Henry felt a tightening in his chest. Children and war should never share the same space in his mind, but there they were, colliding brutally. He hesitated. Part of him wanted to move on, to keep his distance, as he had learned to do with almost everything since returning from combat. Another part, the one that had survived the trenches, knew that ignoring a silent plea for help had never been an option. He took another deep breath and took his first step towards the park. As he drew closer, the crying became clearer, more human, more real. It wasn't a tantrum or a sound of passing frustration. It was a cry laden with fear, loneliness, and exhaustion. Henry felt a lump forming in his throat. Each step seemed to echo old memories, recollections of devastated foreign villages, of frightened civilians, of promises he had made to himself and never knew if he had kept. The war veteran clenched his fists in his coat pockets, trying to stay anchored in the present. He stopped a few meters from the child. It was a small girl, sitting on the cold ground, hugging her knees as if she wanted to disappear. Her face was wet with tears, her hair disheveled by the wind. Henry didn't say anything immediately. He had learned that silence was sometimes the most respectful way to approach someone. He simply knelt down slowly, keeping a certain distance so as not to frighten her. The girl looked up for a second and then looked back at the ground, as if she didn't trust the world enough to hold its gaze. The war veteran felt something break inside him. It wasn't a sound, but an old, familiar sensation. The same one he'd felt years ago, when the war had taught him that some wounds don't bleed on the outside. Henry realized that this encounter wasn't accidental. There was something bigger at stake, something he didn't yet understand. The child's cry wasn't just a plea for help. It was a call that transcended time, war, and the choices he'd made since then. As the wind continued to blow and the city lights began to come on, Henry Jones, a war veteran, remained there, kneeling before the unknown girl. Without yet knowing who she was, without imagining the profound connection that bound them, he felt with painful clarity that this night would change everything. Something was about to be revealed. Something that would force him to confront the past he had tried so hard to leave behind. And in that silence, heavy with melancholy, destiny began to move. The life of Henry Jones, a war veteran, followed a rhythm that few would notice from the outside. To the city, he was just another solitary, discreet man who greeted with a short nod and avoided long conversations. The silence of the early morning was safer. In it, thoughts came, but they came controllably. When the sun rose, he was already sitting at the small kitchen table, drinking an overly strong coffee, staring at the wall as if an invisible map of everything he had lost were projected there. The small apartment where he lived perfectly reflected who he had become after the war. Few pieces of furniture, everything functional, nothing superfluous, no photographs on the walls, no object that suggested emotional attachment. The war veteran had learned, even on the battlefield, that too much attachment made loss unbearable. The old clock on the refrigerator ticked constantly, almost irritatingly, but Henry kept it there precisely for that reason. The sound anchored him in the present, reminding him that time was still passing, even when his mind insisted on remaining stuck in the past. He worked in general services for the city hall, a simple, repetitive, but predictable job. The predictability was a relief. Street sweeping, minor park repairs, fence painting, nothing that required deep interaction with other people. His colleagues knew Henry Jones was a war veteran, but they rarely asked about it. There was a silent agreement of respect and distance. When someone mentioned the word war, Henry's gaze hardened, became more distant, and the subject quickly changed. The small town seemed too small to contain everything he carried. Every corner brought a hazy memory, a nameless feeling. Henry walked the streets as if traversing familiar yet hostile territory. He knew the times when the bakery was empty, the moments when the market was quietest, the days when the square was almost deserted. He instinctively avoided crowds. The war veteran still assessed escape routes with his gaze, still measured distances, still identified high points and shaded areas. It was automatic. It didn't matter how many years had passed since the end of the war. His neighbors saw him as polite but reserved. Linda Smith, who lived in the apartment next door, often tried to strike up a conversation in the hallways. She would talk about the weather, the city, small trivialities. Henry would respond with short phrases, always respectful, but never inviting. He didn't want to be rude. He simply no longer knew how to sustain relationships that required emotional openness. The war had taught him to function alone, to depend only on himself. Any attempt at closeness triggered an internal alarm that was difficult to explain. At night, the loneliness intensified. Henry always ate dinner early, almost always the same thing. Afterward, he would sit in the old armchair near the window, watching the street as if on guard duty. The war veteran had maintained this habit since his return. It was there that the heaviest thoughts arose. He remembered the faces that never returned, the voices that were silenced forever. They weren't clear memories, but fragments, sensations, weights on his chest. On some days, he managed to control them. On others, he needed to get up and walk around the city late into the night, just to tire his body enough for his mind to surrender. Henry Jones didn't drink excessively, didn't get into trouble, didn't draw attention to himself. Even so, there was a constant aura of tension around him. Charles Wilson, the owner of a small bar downtown, once commented that Henry always seemed ready for something bad to happen. The comment wasn't a criticism, it was an observation. The war veteran truly lived in this state of permanent readiness. He didn't completely relax, not even when he was alone. It was as if the world was too fragile to be trusted. The invisible scars were the hardest to bear. Henry rarely spoke about what he felt, but he carried guilt, fear, and a persistent sense of inadequacy. He had survived when many had not, and this truth haunted him every day. There were times when he wondered if he truly deserved the quiet life he now led. The war had taken much from him, but it had also given him a burden, the responsibility of continuing to live. Even so, there were small rituals that kept him functional. Every morning, he made his bed with almost military precision. Every night, he checked doors and windows more than once. The war veteran needed these gestures to feel in control. Without them, the inner chaos threatened to overflow. He didn't seek therapy. He didn't participate in support groups. Part of him believed that talking wouldn't change anything. Another part simply didn't want to reopen old wounds. The city continued its indifferent routine, and Henry Jones followed his, like two parallel lines that rarely crossed in any meaningful way. He believed his life would always be like this. Silent days, long nights, memories forcibly controlled. There was no room for surprises, nor for unexpected connections. At least, that's what he thought. Because, unbeknownst to him, that carefully constructed routine was already beginning to crumble. And the crying he had heard in the park was not just an isolated sound that night. It was the first sign that his life, so rigidly contained, was about to change irreversibly. When war veteran Henry Jones finally lay down, his body weary, his mind still struggling. He stared at the dark ceiling, breathing deeply, mentally repeating that he was home, that he was safe, that the war was over. But deep down, he knew. For some soldiers, war never truly ends. It merely changes form. And in that small, seemingly tranquil town, it was about to reappear in a way he could never have imagined. As this story unfolds, you may have already felt the weight of the silence that Henry carries. If this type of deep and human storytelling resonates with you, leave a like now. It helps the channel continue bringing you stories that truly matter. Each like is a sign that this content deserves to reach more people who need to hear it. And if you're not already a subscriber to the channel, consider subscribing. Here, every story is built with respect, emotion, and purpose. By subscribing, you ensure you won't miss out on stories that resonate, provoke thought, and stay with you. Stories like this are not just entertainment, they are experiences. Stay with us and follow each chapter until the end. Before becoming a war veteran, before the invisible scars, before the heavy silence that came to accompany him, Henry Jones was just an ordinary boy growing up in a small town in the American Midwest. Back then, the world still seemed predictable, almost simple. Mornings began with the distant sound of trucks passing on the main road and the smell of coffee wafting from the kitchen. Henry grew up in a modest, aged wooden house, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to protect the family from the rest of the world. There, he learned early on the value of discipline, respect, and keeping one's word. His father, Michael Davis, wasn't a military man, but he carried a rigid demeanor shaped by a life of hard work and few concessions. Michael believed that character was something built every day, in small gestures. He spoke little, but when he did, Henry listened. His mother, Karen Brown, was the counterpoint. Affectionate and patient, she always found a way to soften the weight of the expectations placed on her son. It was from her that Henry inherited the sensitivity he would later try to hide. Karen said that true strength wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to keep going even when it was present. Henry's childhood was marked by simple freedom. He spent hours exploring the outskirts of town, crossing fields, fishing in the creek, and watching the sky change color at dusk. There was a constant sense of belonging. The town knew him by name, and he knew every street, every shortcut. Charles Wilson, who years later would become the owner of the local bar, was at the time just a young man a few years older, someone Henry admired from afar. Charles always seemed to know where he was going, something Henry was still trying to understand within himself. At school, Henry wasn't the brightest student, but he was disciplined. He liked history, especially when the books talked about ancient wars, leaders, and decisions that changed the course of the world. It wasn't a fascination with violence, but with the idea of purpose, of sacrifice for something greater. He naively believed that courage was something clear, almost heroic. The teachers said he had potential, but Henry didn't know exactly what for. The future was too long a road to be fully seen. Adolescence brought deeper questions. Henry began to feel the weight of social and family expectations. The city offered few options. Many young people followed the same path: local jobs, predictable lives, dreams adjusted to a limited reality. Henry felt a growing internal conflict. Part of him wanted to stay, to build a simple life close to his family. Another part yearned for something bigger, something that would give meaning to the restlessness he couldn't name. It was during this time that he met Linda Smith, a schoolmate, someone who represented everything he could have been if he had chosen to stay. Linda was practical, realistic, and spoke about the future with a naturalness that Henry envied. They talked at length about dreams, about leaving the city, about the fear of never leaving. But while Linda saw these conversations as hypotheticals, Henry felt them as a calling. The decisive moment came silently, almost unnoticed. One afternoon, sitting in his living room, Henry watched a news report about conflicts abroad. American soldiers, young like him, sent to distant, dangerous places. He observed the faces on the screen, heard words like duty, service, protection. It touched something deep within him. It wasn't excitement, nor a desire for glory. It was the clear feeling that he needed to do something that would give meaning to his own existence. Talking to his parents wasn't easy. Michael Davis listened silently as Henry announced his intention to enlist. His father's gaze was unreadable, a mixture of pride and worry. Karen Brown cried, tried to reason with him, begged him to think it over. She knew her son's heart and feared the world would be too cruel to him. Henry listened to everything, absorbed every word. But the decision had already been made. He couldn't fully explain why. He just felt he needed to go. In the days leading up to his departure, Henry walked through the city as if bidding farewell to every detail. The streets, the fields, the stream, the school, everything seemed more intense, more alive. He realized how much that place had shaped him, even when he believed he needed to escape it. On the last night before leaving, Karen entered his room and left a simple note on the table. In it, she wrote only, "Remember who you are." Henry kept those words like an invisible shield. When he first donned the uniform, he wasn't yet a war veteran. He was just a young man carrying values, dreams, and a still incomplete view of the world. He believed he was prepared. He believed that war would be something he would face and then leave behind. He didn't yet know that this choice would redefine every part of who he was. That boy from the American Midwest was about to disappear, giving way to a man who would carry the war with him far beyond the battlefield. And so, Henry Jones crossed the invisible line between who he had been and who he would become. The past, full of simplicity and hope, was behind him. Ahead lay only the unknown. And the war, silent and relentless, was already beginning to claim its place in his life. War didn't announce its arrival in Henry Jones's life with immediate explosions. For him, it all began with waiting. Long hours of silence broken by short orders, tense glances, and a constant feeling that something invisible was watching his every move. He wasn't yet officially a war veteran, but the process of becoming one had begun there. The suffocating heat, the metallic smell in the air, the dust that seeped into everything, none of it resembled the stories he had read in his youth. There was no clear heroism, only survival. Henry quickly learned that war was made up of small moments that accumulated until they crushed the spirit. The distant sound of gunfire, never knowing if it was approaching or receding. The radio crackling with incomplete messages. The exhaustion that didn't disappear even after sleep. He observed the other soldiers, trying to understand how each one dealt with fear. Some made jokes, others withdrew into absolute silence. Henry stayed in the middle, attentive, absorbing everything. He still believed he needed to be strong, that showing doubt would be a mistake. It was in the first real combat that something changed irreversibly. There was no time to think, only to react. The body moved before the mind, trained to obey. Henry remembers disjointed flashes, the ground trembling, voices shouting names, the dry sound of gunfire echoing in his chest. He didn't feel fear at that moment, he felt focus, a terrifying clarity. But when it was all over, when the noise ceased, the weight came. The silence after the combat was worse than any explosion. It was in that silence that reality imposed itself. Friends didn't answer the call. Their eyes met without a word. Henry felt something shift inside him, as if an essential part had been torn away and replaced by a heavy emptiness. That night he couldn't sleep. He closed his eyes and relived fragmented scenes, always incomplete, always worse in his imagination. It was the first time he realized that the war didn't stay on the battlefield. It entered his mind without asking permission. As the months passed, Henry Jones accumulated experiences that no amount of training could fully prepare him for. He saw villages reduced to silence, ordinary people trapped in conflicts they didn't understand. Every frightened face was etched into his memory. The war veteran he didn't yet know he would become began to take shape there, molded not only by violence, but by powerlessness. There were situations where it didn't matter how much he wanted to help. The decisions came from above, cold and strategic. Henry obeyed, but each order left an invisible mark. Losses became part of the routine, one less name in the formation, an empty bunk, an abandoned piece of equipment. Henry began to count time not in days, but in absences. He wondered why he was still there, why some survived and others didn't. Guilt began to slowly creep in. Survivor's guilt, although he didn't yet know how to name it. He just felt it. He felt it too much. The hardest moments weren't those of intense combat, but the instants of deceptive calm. It was when his mind had space to remember. Henry remembered the wooden house, his mother's voice, the conversations with his father. These memories came like unexpected blows, making his chest tighten. He began to avoid thinking about the past, believing it weakened him. He created an internal barrier, hardened himself. It worked in the short term. In the long term, it would cost him dearly. There was one specific mission that never left him. It wasn't the most violent, nor the longest, but it was the one that marked him definitively. Something went wrong. Faulty information, miscalculated timing. Henry did what he could, reacted as he had been trained, but the result was devastating. He remembers holding the hand of a wounded comrade, trying to remain calm, saying that everything would be all right, even knowing it was a lie. The feeling of helplessness at that moment became an open wound that never fully healed. After that, Henry changed. The others noticed even before he did. He became quieter, more distant. He performed his tasks with almost mechanical precision. The war veteran was being forged there, not by courage, but by the need to keep functioning despite the pain. At night, the nightmares began. Always different, always similar. He would wake up sweating, his heart racing, trying to convince himself that he was safe. Some soldiers sought help. Henry did not. He believed that enduring in silence was part of his duty. When the news finally came that he would be returning home, Henry didn't feel immediate relief. He felt empty. Part of him no longer knew who he was outside of that context. The war had redefined him. He had left young, idealistic. He returned as a war veteran, carrying images, sounds, and sensations that could not be left behind. On the return flight, he watched the clouds through the window, trying to imagine what life would be like afterward. He couldn't. Upon setting foot on American soil again, everything seemed both familiar and strange. People spoke too loudly, laughed too easily. Henry felt he had returned to a world that had continued spinning without him. The uniform that once represented purpose now weighed heavily on his shoulders. He didn't know how to explain what he had experienced, nor did he want to. He preferred silence. The scars of the battlefield weren't visible on his body, but they were present in every reaction. Sudden noises made him shudder. Enclosed spaces caused discomfort. Crowds were unbearable. The war veteran he had become didn't know how to switch off his state of alert. The war had officially ended, but inside Henry Jones, it remained active, silent, and relentless. And so, carrying traumas that didn't bleed, Henry returned home believing the worst was behind him. He didn't yet know that the hardest part of the war would begin there, far from the battlefield, where there were no clear orders, no visible enemies, only memories. And memories never ask permission to return. The child's cries wouldn't leave Henry Jones's mind as he left the park that night. Even after taking her to safety, even after ensuring someone from the community would temporarily accompany her, something remained open within him. The war veteran walked back home with slower steps than usual. Each meter seemed to pull him back, as if an invisible line still connected him to that cold bench, to that frail voice trembling with fear. Henry knew that feeling well. It was the same feeling that preceded an important mission, when the body already knew that nothing would ever be the same again. In the following days, routine tried to impose itself. Work, schedules, repeated gestures. But normalcy was compromised. Henry realized this on the very first morning when he spilled coffee on the table, and stared at the dark stain for too long. The image of the girl appeared in his mind without warning. The way she avoided eye contact, the way she held the sleeve of her coat, as if that were the only possible anchor. The war veteran felt a growing unease, a restlessness he couldn't rationally justify. It was on the third day that the summoning event finally materialized. Arriving home from work, Henry found a simple envelope slipped under the door. There was no return address, just his name handwritten in firm, careful letters. He stood still for a few seconds, assessing the object as he would with anything unfamiliar. Instinct spoke loudly. Only then did he bend down, pick up the envelope, and close the door behind him, locking it carefully. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and an old photograph. The photo showed a younger man in uniform, with a tired but sincere smile. Beside him were a woman and a small child. Henry felt his heart race. He recognized that uniform. He recognized that look. The man in the photo was a war veteran, just like him. The name written on the back made his breath catch for a moment. Charles Wilson. Not the bar owner he knew now, but a Charles Wilson from years ago. Someone who had served in the same conflict, though in different units. The letter was short, direct, almost too restrained for the weight it carried. It simply stated that the child in the park was Mary Rodriguez, the daughter of a war veteran who had not returned unscathed from civilian life. It said there were old debts, unfulfilled promises, and that Henry Jones had been chosen because he knew what to do. There were no explicit threats, no clear requests, just a final sentence that echoed like a silent gunshot. Some battles continue after the war. Henry sat down at the table, the letter trembling slightly between his fingers. The war veteran felt the old weight in his chest, that pressure that always arose when the past came knocking. He didn't like coincidences. In war, coincidences were often disguises for fatal mistakes. The girl hadn't just been a lost child. She was part of something bigger, something that now demanded his attention. In the days that followed, Henry began to observe the city more closely. Small details that had previously gone unnoticed now took on significance. Conversations were interrupted when he approached. Quick glances were averted. Linda Smith casually mentioned that she had seen a child being left alone near the park on more than one occasion. Charles Wilson, the bar owner, became visibly uncomfortable when Henry mentioned the name Mary Rodriguez in a seemingly trivial conversation. The war veteran realized that there was a silent network of acquaintances and that he was entering it without formal invitation. The internal conflict intensified. Part of Henry wanted to distance himself, to pretend it didn't concern him. He already carried too many scars. He had already paid a high price for choices made in the past. But another part, deeper, older, refused to ignore the call. He remembered promises made on the battlefield, promises between men who believed that if they survived, they would take care of each other. War created bonds that did not disappear with time. Henry began to investigate discreetly. He spoke with city hall officials, consulted old records, listened to fragmented stories. He discovered that Mary Rodriguez's father had been a war veteran who had fought honorably but had never been able to fully reintegrate. Financial problems, isolation, distrust. A path Henry knew well. The difference was that this man had a daughter, and now she was alone in the world in a way that no child should be. Each new piece of information increased the weight of the approaching decision. The war veteran felt the conflict intensifying within him. Logic told him to keep his distance. Experience told him that if he didn't act, someone would get hurt. Perhaps not physically, but in more lasting ways. Henry was beginning to understand that the calling event wasn't just external. It was internal. It was the collision between who he had become to survive and who he had been before the war. On a particularly quiet night, Henry returned to the park. The same bench, the same lamppost, the same cold wind. He sat there for long minutes, staring at the empty space where Mary had been days before. The war veteran closed his eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, he didn't try to push away the memories. He let them come. He saw old faces, heard lost voices, felt the weight of the choices he had made. And in the midst of it all, a painful clarity emerged. That child was a responsibility he could not ignore without betraying everything that remained of his inner code. The calling event was complete. Henry Jones's routine had been definitively shattered. There was no going back to the comfort of isolation. The war, which he believed he had left behind, had found a new way to manifest itself. Not with weapons or orders, but with a silent plea for help. And the war veteran knew with a painful certainty that answering this call would mean confronting ghosts he had spent years avoiding. As he rose from the bench and walked back home, Henry Jones was no longer the same man who had sat there minutes before. Something within him had been awakened. An ancient sense of duty, forgotten but intact. The next battle would not be fought in foreign lands, nor against a visible enemy. It would be fought there, in that small town, against the past, against fear, and against the temptation to remain silent. And this time there was a child at the center of it all. The decision didn't come as a heroic impulse, nor as an immediate cinematic gesture. It came slowly, heavily, built in layers of internal conflict. Henry Jones spent the night awake after returning from the park. The war veteran sat in the armchair, his hands resting on his knees, staring blankly into space. He knew that state. It was the same one that preceded a difficult operation, when the mind rehearsed all possible scenarios, trying to reduce risks that could never be completely eliminated. The difference was that, this time, there were no official orders. There was no superior to assume responsibility. The choice was exclusively his. At dawn, Henry rose with a quiet determination. There was no bravado, no inspiring inner dialogue. There was only an unsettling certainty. Ignoring Mary Rodriguez would be repeating a pattern the war had taught him to despise, turning his back when someone vulnerable needed protection. The war veteran knew that acting would mean exposing himself, emotionally and possibly physically. But he also knew that not acting would condemn him to a kind of guilt he already knew all too well. He started with the basics: observation, planning. Henry returned to the park at different times, mapped the surroundings, identified who was in the area. The military training emerged naturally, almost automatically. He wasn't proud of it, but he didn't deny it either. Those skills, acquired in the midst of war, were still useful. It was the instinct of someone who didn't feel safe anywhere, but needed to be where she could be seen if something went wrong. This realization hit him hard. Mary wasn't just lost. She was in a constant state of alert, just like him. The first deliberate contact happened on a cloudy afternoon. Henry approached carefully, without haste, keeping enough distance not to appear threatening. He sat on the furthest bench and allowed his presence to be perceived gradually. The war veteran knew that trust isn't demanded, it's built. Mary watched him out of the corner of her eye, her body tense, ready to run. Henry spoke little. He commented on the weather, on the rusty swing that creaked when the wind blew. Nothing personal, nothing invasive. Gradually, the tension eased. Not completely, but enough for Mary to remain there. At one point, she asked if he was a soldier. The question came directly, without beating around the bush. Henry felt the impact, but didn't flinch. He answered truthfully. He said he was a war veteran. He didn't elaborate. He didn't romanticize it. He simply stated it. Mary's gaze changed. She didn't smile, but she stopped moving away. Henry's courage lay not in confronting someone, but in confronting himself. He saw himself in her in ways he hadn't expected. A soldier trained to resist, now learning to be gentle again. The war veteran felt fear. Fear of failing. Fear of getting too involved. The turning point came when Henry realized that Mary was being watched inappropriately by other adults. Nothing explicit, but enough to trigger all his internal alarms. The war veteran assessed the situation calmly. He didn't confront her. He didn't create immediate conflict. He simply positioned himself. He became present whenever Mary was in the park. His posture, his silent vigilance, his firm presence were clear messages to anyone who knew how to interpret them. That child was not alone. One afternoon, Mary finally spoke about her father. Briefly, broken sentences. She said he had also been a war veteran. Henry listened in silence, feeling each word like a contained blow. He recognized that description. He recognized it too well. When Mary asked if all war veterans were like that, Henry hesitated to answer. Honesty was the only way. He said many were, because the war didn't end when you went home. Admitting vulnerability in front of a child, acknowledging limitations, was something the war had never taught him. But there, on that cold bench, the war veteran was learning a new kind of bravery. One that involved neither weapons, nor orders, nor clear victory. Only humanity. Henry began to act more concretely. He sought social services, but cautiously. He knew the distrust of those who had already been disappointed by the system. He wouldn't entrust Mary to any improvised solution. He positioned himself as an intermediary, as a temporary shield. He wasn't a legal guardian. He wasn't a hero. He was someone present. And at that moment, that was all. Henry Jones's act of courage was not an isolated gesture, but a sequence of difficult choices made daily. Choosing to return to the park, choosing to listen, choosing to stay when it would have been easier to leave. The war veteran was relearning something essential that the war had tried to erase. Protecting is not just facing danger, but remaining by the side of those who cannot face it alone. Something that had survived the war, wounded but not destroyed. Just waiting for him to have enough courage to recognize it. The conflict didn't arrive with sirens or immediate confrontations. It settled in slowly, almost invisibly, like a constant pressure tightening in Henry Jones's chest with each passing day. The war veteran began to notice that his presence beside Mary Rodriguez was attracting unwanted attention. Lingering gazes, interrupted comments when he approached. Subtle changes in the behavior of those around him. The city, once indifferent, now seemed to be watching, and Henry knew, from bitter experience, that when an environment changes like that, something is about to happen. Tension rose when he received an unexpected visitor at home. It was Linda Smith, visibly uncomfortable, clutching her purse too tightly. She didn't enter immediately. She stood in the doorway, as if assessing whether she should even be there. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, heavy with concern. She said rumors were circulating, that some people believed Henry was getting too involved in something that wasn't his problem. The war veteran listened silently, his gaze steady, but something stirred inside. He knew that kind of narrative. That's how blame began to be shifted to the person trying to do the right thing. Linda mentioned, almost in a whisper, the name of a man Henry had only heard fragmented until then. Michael Davis, a war veteran who had never managed to reintegrate. Someone who had lived on the fringes of the city, accumulating debt, resentment, and distrust. Mary Rodriguez's father. Linda explained that Michael had disappeared months before, leaving behind unfinished business that no one wanted to acknowledge. Some people believed he could return at any moment. Others feared exactly that. Henry felt a chill run down his spine. The story was beginning to come together in a disturbing way. The greater conflict arose when Henry realized that Mary's presence was being used as a silent bargaining chip. There were no direct threats, but there was pressure. Social services appeared abruptly, without warning, asking generic but incisive questions. People who had previously ignored the child now showed excessive, bureaucratic, cold interest. The war veteran recognized the pattern. When the system moves too quickly, it's usually not to protect, but to end a problem. Internally, the conflict was even more intense. Henry began to question his own motivations. Was he helping Mary for her sake, or was he trying to redeem something within himself? This doubt gnawed at him. The war had taught him to distrust his own emotions. He feared he was projecting his guilt, his losses onto that child. The war veteran knew that good intentions did not negate bad consequences. If he made a mistake, Mary could pay the price. The nightmares returned with a vengeance. Henry would wake up in the middle of the night with his heart racing, reliving scenarios that mixed the battlefield with the city. In his dreams, he tried to protect someone and failed. He always failed. The greater conflict wasn't just external. It was the constant struggle between the desire to protect and the paralyzing fear of repeating past mistakes. The situation worsened when Henry was confronted directly by Charles Wilson, the bar owner. The encounter took place late one afternoon when the establishment was almost empty. Charles spoke with unusual frankness. He said that there were people pressuring for Mary to be removed from the city and placed in state custody, far away. He said that Henry's name was being mentioned as an obstacle. The war veteran felt the familiar sensation of being surrounded, of being watched by forces greater than himself. Charles also revealed something Henry didn't yet fully understand. Michael Davis, Mary's father, owed favors to the wrong people. People who neither forgot nor forgave. The child wasn't just vulnerable because she was alone. She represented a loose end in a web of moral and practical debts that crisscrossed the city. The larger conflict now had clear outlines. Protecting Mary meant confronting not only bureaucracies, but also silent interests, old resentments, and collective fears. Henry left the bar with his mind in turmoil. The war veteran felt the old pressure intensifying. The world was beginning to resemble a battlefield dangerously, not because of immediate physical danger, but because of moral ambiguity. There were no clean decisions. Any path implied losses. He could walk away and let the system sort it out, knowing that Mary would likely be displaced, depersonalized, treated as a mere case. Or he could stay and become a target, risking losing what little balance he had gained. The conflict reached its peak when Mary asked, with devastating simplicity, if he was leaving too. The question came without drama, almost casually, but it carried an unbearable weight. Henry felt the impact like a direct blow to the chest. The war veteran knew what it meant to lose that. He knew what he did to someone, especially a child. External pressures mounted. A formal notice was left on his door, requesting that he attend a meeting with local authorities. The tone was polite, but inflexible. Henry recognized the vocabulary. It wasn't an invitation, it was a disguised ultimatum. The larger conflict now demanded a clear response. Remaining neutral was no longer an option. Alone at home, Henry Jones stared at his reflection in the mirror. The war veteran saw there not only the weary man he had become, but the young man who had once believed in duty, honor, and protection. The war had distorted those concepts, but it hadn't destroyed them. He felt the weight of the decisions settle on his shoulders. Any choice would have a cost. But for the first time in a long time, he was willing to pay it. The greater conflict wasn't just about Mary Rodriguez. It was about who Henry Jones would choose to be from then on. The war veteran was about to face the greatest battle since returning home. Not with weapons, but with moral courage. Not against a visible enemy, but against fear, the system, and the ghosts of the past. And he knew with painful clarity that this time there would be no strategic retreat. The breaking point didn't happen in public, nor in front of those who were pressuring Henry Jones. It came in the absolute silence of a dawn, when the war veteran could no longer distinguish whether he was awake or trapped in yet another fragment of the past. The house was dark, still, and yet it seemed to pulse with a restless energy. He staggered to his feet and went to the kitchen sink. He turned on the tap and let the water run, watching his own hands tremble. The war veteran breathed heavily, trying to apply techniques he had learned to stay functional. But that night, nothing seemed to work. The defenses he had built up over the years began to crumble one by one. The larger conflict, which had been building up, had finally found a breach. Henry sat on the floor, his back against the cupboard, and for the first time since returning from the war, he allowed himself to cry. It wasn't a loud or dramatic cry. It was restrained, almost silent, but laden with years of forced restraint. The images came unfiltered, faces of comrades he had lost, promises whispered amidst the chaos, the constant feeling of having survived when others didn't have that chance. The guilt, always there, returned with overwhelming force. Amidst this collapse, the image of Mary Rodriguez emerged with painful clarity. The cautious gaze, the simple question, would he leave too? This struck Henry like nothing before. He realized that what terrified him most wasn't confronting the system, nor the hidden interests of the city. It was failing again. It was repeating the role of someone who can't protect those in need. The war veteran felt he was on the verge of proving to himself that he had never truly been strong, just resilient enough to keep breathing. The memories intensified, blending past and present. Henry found himself holding the hand of a wounded comrade, listening to empty promises escape his own lips. He felt again the overwhelming powerlessness, the certainty that there wasn't enough time, that no decision would be quick enough. The war veteran realized he had never forgiven himself for that. He had never accepted that some losses could not be avoided. The rift deepened when he began to question whether he truly had the right to be involved in Mary's life. Who was he to try to save someone when he had barely managed to save himself? The idea of stepping away, of allowing others to take over, began to seem like a form of self-protection. The war veteran considered writing a letter, explaining that he could no longer be present. He thought about disappearing quietly, as he had done with so many emotions over the years. But then came the cruelest and clearest memory. Not from the battlefield, but from his childhood. Karen Brown's voice telling him to remember who he was. That phrase, kept hidden for so long, resurfaced with unexpected force. Henry realized he was about to betray not only Mary, but everything he had learned before the war. Everything that had made him human before he became a war veteran. The emotional collapse reached its peak when Henry acknowledged a truth he had avoided for years. He was afraid to live, afraid to form bonds, afraid to lose again. The war had taught him to survive, but never to rebuild. And now, facing Mary, he was confronted with the need to do just that. The war veteran felt small, tired, profoundly flawed. He spent hours in that position, alternating between memories and absolute silence. The sky began to lighten slowly, announcing a new day that he didn't know if he was ready to face. When the sun finally rose, Henry struggled to his feet. His face was marked by fatigue, his eyes red. The war veteran looked older than ever, but something was different. The collapse had left an empty space, and in that space, a decision was beginning to take shape. Henry realized that this was the emotional bottom he had avoided for years. There was no way down further. Either he would remain there, paralyzed by fear and guilt, or he would use that pain as a turning point. The war veteran understood that he didn't need to be perfect to protect Mary. He only needed to be present, even imperfect, even scared. The breaking point didn't bring immediate relief. It brought clarity. Henry Jones accepted, with pain and humility, that he would never completely be free of the war. It was a part of him. But he also accepted something new, that allowing himself to feel wasn't weakness. It was the only way to avoid repeating the same mistakes. The war veteran wiped his face, took a deep breath, and looked around the empty house. For the first time, that space didn't just seem like a shelter. It seemed like a place where something new could begin. When he left home that morning, his step was still heavy, but there was a different firmness in his walk. The moment of rupture had shattered something essential within him. The illusion that he could continue living on the margins. And, at the same time, it had rebuilt something forgotten. The ability to consciously choose to stay. Henry Jones, a war veteran, was still wounded. He was still afraid. But now I knew that giving up was no longer an option. The worst was over. And after that, all that remained was to move forward. The breakthrough didn't come with a bang, but with a sequence of decisions that unfolded too quickly to allow for hesitation. Henry Jones felt it in his body before he understood it with his mind. The war veteran woke up that morning with a harsh, almost cutting clarity. The breaking point was behind him. Now there was action. Not impulsive action, but deliberate action. The same action he had learned to execute under pressure when mistakes cost lives. The difference was that, this time, the goal wasn't to defeat an enemy. It was to protect a child, and in doing so, confront the greatest fear he had carried since the end of the war. Failing when it mattered most. The meeting with local authorities was scheduled for late afternoon. Henry knew that this meeting would define the course of everything. The war veteran prepared as if for a critical mission. He reviewed information, organized documents, noted dates and names. He spoke with Charles Wilson, who agreed to testify about the city's history and the situation in Mary Rodriguez. He sought out Linda Smith, who, though apprehensive, agreed to be present. Henry was no longer alone, and recognizing this, for him, was already a gigantic step. Before the meeting, Henry did something he never imagined he would do. He returned to the park and found Mary sitting on the same bench as always. The war veteran approached slowly, sat beside her, and spoke with direct honesty, without grand promises. He said that some people might try to drive them away. He said he didn't know all the answers. But he said, with the firmness that only someone who has been through war knows, that he wouldn't disappear. Mary listened in silence, and when she grasped the sleeve of his coat, Henry felt the weight and strength of that simple gesture. There was the reason for everything. The meeting began tensely. The room was cold, impersonal, filled with technical terms that transformed lives into legal proceedings. Henry Jones listened, responded, and restrained his impulses. The war veteran quickly realized there was a clear intention to close the case quickly, moving Mary to another county. When given the floor, Henry spoke little, but spoke precisely. He didn't resort to cheap emotion. He spoke of responsibility. He spoke of continuity. He spoke of the impact that instability had on children who had already lost too much. When he mentioned being a war veteran, he didn't do so to demand respect, but to contextualize his ability to handle high-pressure situations and responsibility. He spoke about commitment, about not abandoning someone halfway through. Charles Wilson added to this, bringing up the story of Mary's father, also a war veteran, and the system's failures to support him. Linda Smith spoke of Henry's constant presence and the visible change in the child's behavior. Each word was a brick laid against the previously decided outcome that already seemed to have been decided. The turning point came when one of the representatives directly questioned Henry's emotional stability. The war veteran felt the blow. That was when everything could crumble. For a moment, the old fear tried to take control. But Henry took a deep breath and did something he had never done before in an official context. He admitted it. He admitted that he carried traumas. He admitted that the war had left its mark. And he stated, with a hard-won serenity, that recognizing these marks was precisely what made him aware of his limitations and responsibilities. The silence that followed was heavy. The war veteran then realized that his overcoming was not about denying the past, but about integrating it. He wasn't a fixed man. He was a man in process. And this, paradoxically, gave him a solidity that no one there expected. The decision wasn't announced immediately, but Henry left the room with the clear feeling that something had changed. Hours later, the confirmation came. Mary would not be removed from the city. A provisional supervised guard plan was approved, with Henry as the figurehead, under supervision. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a real breakthrough. The war veteran felt his legs weaken when he received the news. Not from fear, but from restrained relief. He didn't celebrate. He just breathed. For the first time in a long time, he felt he had faced his greatest fear and not retreated. That night, Henry returned home accompanied by Mary. The apartment, previously too quiet, seemed different. No longer empty, but expectant. He prepared a simple meal, watching Mary explore the space with cautious curiosity. Each small gesture, a glass placed on the table, a shy question, a restrained smile, was a silent confirmation that the decision made had been correct. Henry Jones's overcoming of his past wasn't about erasing trauma, nor a sudden transformation into someone without fear. It was the conscious choice to act despite it. The war veteran sat in his armchair that night, listening to the sound of light footsteps in the hallway, and realized something fundamental. The war had taught him to survive. That child was teaching him to live again. When he turned off the light and prepared to sleep, the war veteran felt the memories creeping in, as always. But for the first time, they didn't come alone. They came accompanied by something new: purpose. Henry Jones closed his eyes, knowing that the road ahead would still be difficult, but also knowing that the decisive moment had passed. He had faced his fear, taken responsibility, and chosen to stay. And in that choice, silent and firm, lay his true victory. The outcome didn't present itself as a closed, perfect ending, or one free of scars. It came as life often comes to those who have gone through war and decided to continue. In slow, imperfect, yet real steps. The following morning dawned clear, with a soft light entering through the windows of Henry Jones's apartment. The war veteran woke before his alarm clock, as always, but something was different. The silence was no longer absolute. There was the faint sound of breathing coming from the next room. A simple sound, almost imperceptible, but one that carried a profound meaning. For the first time in many years, Henry was not completely alone. He rose carefully, preparing breakfast as if he were handling something too fragile to be broken. Every gesture was deliberate, not out of fear but out of respect. Mary Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, still sleepy, observing the man who, without promising the impossible, had accomplished the essential: to remain. Henry exchanged a brief glance with her, one of those glances that speaks for itself. The war veteran realized, at that moment, that trust is not born from grand speeches, but from the consistent repetition of small acts. The days that followed were marked by adjustments, consultations, meetings, follow-ups. The system, slow and bureaucratic, continued to demand proof, reports, evaluations. Henry faced everything with the same attitude he had learned on the battlefield: focus, patience, and the awareness that real results are rarely immediate. He didn't romanticize the process. He knew there would be relapses, difficult nights, persistent memories. But now there was something that balanced that weight. The city began, little by little, to change its perspective. Not abruptly nor unanimously, but noticeably. Some people started greeting him with more attention. Others still kept their distance. Henry Jones didn't demand acceptance. The war veteran had learned that external validation didn't sustain anything for very long. What mattered was the consistency between what he believed and what he did. Mary began attending the local school. Small advances became silent victories: a night without nightmares, an unexpected laugh, a question about the future. Henry always answered honestly. He didn't promise that everything would be easy. He only promised that she wouldn't face the difficulties alone. That promise, he knew, was one he could keep. There were nights when the war returned with force, nightmares, cold sweats, that familiar tightness in his chest. On one of those nights, Mary woke up and found Henry sitting in the living room, trying to compose himself. There was no panic. There was no escape. She sat beside him, in silence. That role reversal, the child offering presents, touched Henry deeply. The war veteran understood, with painful and beautiful clarity, that healing doesn't always come in the form we expect. Sometimes, it comes in the form of shared responsibility. Over time, Henry rekindled ties he thought he had lost. He talked more with Linda Smith, who began to help in practical ways. Charles Wilson became a constant support, someone who understood the weight of carrying untold stories. The war veteran didn't suddenly become sociable or extroverted. He simply stopped hiding completely, and that was already an internal revolution. The outcome of that journey did not erase the war from Henry Jones's past. It remained there, like a scar that never fully disappears. But now, that scar had context. It had purpose. He understood that surviving was not the end of the mission. It was only the beginning of another, more complex and less recognized one, to live responsibly despite what was lost. Henry realized that many war veterans are stuck on the idea that they need to be strong all the time, as if fragility negates the value of what they have faced. His relationship with Mary taught him the opposite. True strength lay in remaining present even when fear persisted, in not giving up when it would be easier to disappear, in accepting help, in allowing oneself to feel. One afternoon, sitting in the same park where it had all begun, Henry watched Mary play on the swing. The metallic creaking that had once sounded melancholic now seemed merely part of the scenery. The war veteran closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. He thought of the men who didn't return, those who returned broken, those who were still fighting invisible battles. He thought about how small decisions, made far from the battlefield, also require courage. The outcome of that story wasn't about complete redemption, nor about perfect endings. It was about continuity, about choosing to stay, about understanding that war takes a lot, but it doesn't have to take everything. Henry Jones, a war veteran, found a new kind of mission. Not one that would earn him medals or public recognition, but one that demanded daily presence, patience, and humanity. The moral of that journey wasn't in grand heroic gestures, but in a simple and profound truth. Some of the most important battles aren't fought with weapons, but with silent choices made every day. And sometimes, saving someone doesn't mean rescuing them from immediate danger, but walking alongside them while they learn to trust the world again. Henry Jones didn't cease being a war veteran. He simply stopped being defined solely by it. And in doing so, he discovered that even after everything, it was still possible to rebuild something worth protecting. Because in the end, true victory is not surviving the war. It's not allowing it to rob us of the capacity to care, to remain, and to love. If you've made it this far, it's because this story resonated with you on some level. So, if it makes sense, subscribe to the channel to keep following narratives like this. Stories that don't rush, don't shout, but stay with you. They exist for those who like to look deeper, reflect, and see beyond the surface. If you want, leave a comment saying, "I made it to the end," or "This message was for me." I read each one, and that helps me understand who's been walking this path together until the very last minute. And if this journey has created any connection with you, a like is a simple way to show it. No pressure, just a gesture of support. There's a video over there that complements this topic and continues this conversation in a natural way. Click on it, follow me there, and we'll continue from here.